The plasma cannon fire lit up the battlefield in violent bursts of blue and orange, each explosion sending tremors through the rocky ground of Kepler 442b. Captain Sarah Chen pressed her back against the twisted wreckage of a Valerian transport, her breathing heavy inside her combat suit as she watched the carnage unfold through her tactical display. The Valorians had been retreating for 3 hours now, their proud warrior culture finally bending under the relentless assault of the Krex Dominion. Sarah's diplomatic mission had turned into a nightmare when the Krex launched their surprise attack just as she was concluding trade negotiations on this neutral world. "Captain, we need to move," Lieutenant Torres whispered through the calm, his voice tight with urgency. "Krex ground forces are advancing on our position. The shuttle is prepped for immediate departure." Sarah nodded, but something caught her eye in the scanner readings. Among the retreating Valerian forces, one heat signature had stopped moving. It was larger than a standard Valerian soldier, much larger, but the biosigns were weak and fading fast. "Torres, what's that signature about 200 meters southeast of our position?" "Scanning now, Captain." A pause. "It appears to be a Valerian combat hound, ma'am. Heavily wounded based on the thermal readings. Looks like it was left behind." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard stories about the Valerian combat hounds, massive, intelligent creatures that bonded with their handlers for life. They were not just weapons or tools, but companions, partners in battle. The fact that one had been abandoned spoke to the desperation of the Valerian retreat. "Life signs?" she asked. "Fading but stable for now. However, Captain, the Krex will be here in minutes. We cannot delay departure any longer." Through her helmet's enhanced vision, Sarah could see the creature now. It lay partially hidden behind a boulder, its sleek, muscular form reminiscent of a cross between a wolf and a panther, but twice the size of either. Its fur was a deep blue-black that seemed to absorb light, and she could see the telltale shimmer of the neural interface crown that allowed it to communicate with its handler. Blood matted its fur from multiple wounds, and one of its powerful hind legs was clearly broken. The creature's large, intelligent eyes met hers across the battlefield, and she felt something twist in her chest. There was no fear in those eyes, only a resigned acceptance of death. The Hound knew it had been abandoned. It knew the Krex would find it soon, and it knew what they would do to a wounded enemy. "Captain, Krex forces are cresting the ridge. We have maybe 90 seconds before they have line of sight on our position." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, weighing her options. The smart choice, the safe choice, was to leave. The combat hound was not her responsibility. It belonged to an alien species that had been barely more than cordial trading partners until this moment. Saving it would risk her crew, potentially start an interstellar incident, and accomplish nothing strategically valuable. But, as she opened her eyes and looked at the creature again, she realized that the strategic value was not the point. The point was that something was dying alone and afraid while she had the power to help. "Torres, prep the emergency medical bay. We're bringing a passenger." "Captain, are you certain?" "The risks are calculated and acceptable. Ready the gravitic stretcher and full trauma kit." Sarah broke cover, sprinting across the broken ground as plasma bolts began to sear the air above her. The Krex had spotted the movement and were adjusting their aim, but she was already halfway to the wounded hound. Up close, the creature was even more magnificent and more gravely injured than she had realized. It was easily 8 feet long from nose to tail, with powerful muscles visible beneath its matted fur. The neural crown on its head was cracked, sparking occasionally with damaged circuits. Its breathing was labored, and she could see at least 3 major wounds that were bleeding badly. "Easy, friend," she whispered, not sure if the universal translator would work with the damaged neural crown. "I'm here to help." The hound's eyes widened in what seemed like surprise. It made a low sound, somewhere between a whine and a growl, but there was no aggression in it. If anything, it sounded like confusion. Sarah activated her emergency beacon, signaling Torres to bring the gravitic stretcher. The device would create a localized gravity field that could lift and transport even heavy objects without causing additional trauma. "Incoming fire." Torres' voice crackled through the calm Krex infantry as 300 meters out and closing fast. The plasma bolts were getting closer now, striking the rocks around them and sending fragments flying. Sarah positioned herself between the Hound and the incoming fire, her personal energy shield flaring to life as debris struck it. The gravitic stretcher arrived with a hum, floating just above the ground. Sarah carefully maneuvered it under the wounded creature, adjusting the field parameters for its mass and injury pattern. The Hound whimpered as the gravity field engaged, lifting it gently but firmly onto the stretcher. "That's it," Sarah said, running alongside the stretcher as it began moving toward the shuttle. "Just hold on. We're getting you out of here." Behind them, the Krek's forces had crested the ridge and were now in full view of the evacuation. The air filled with the distinctive whine of charged plasma weapons preparing to fire. "Captain, move!" Torres shouted. Sarah dove for the shuttle's loading ramp just as a concentrated barrage of plasma fire struck the ground where she had been standing. The shuttle's engines were already spinning up, and she could feel the vessel lifting off even before she had fully cleared the ramp. As they climbed away from the battlefield, Sarah looked back at the wounded Hound on the stretcher. The creature's eyes were still open, still aware, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not quite interpret. Gratitude, maybe. Or perhaps just confusion at this unprecedented act. In the medical bay, Dr. Kim Reeves was already running diagnostic scans over the Hound's body, her expression growing more concerned by the moment. "Captain, this creature has suffered massive trauma. Multiple organ damage, severe blood loss, and that broken leg is the least of our problems. I'm not even sure our medical equipment is compatible with its physiology. Do what you can, doctor. Run a full analysis and see what we can adapt from our veterinary protocols." "Veterinary protocols? Captain, this is not exactly a earth dog we're talking about." Sarah looked down at the Hound, noting how its large eyes tracked her movements. There was definitely intelligence there, far beyond any animal she had ever encountered. "No, it's not. But it's a living being that was left to die, and that's something I cannot accept." Over the next several hours, as their ship made its way back to human space, Dr. Reeves worked tirelessly to stabilize the Hound's condition. The creature's physiology was indeed complex, part organic, part cybernetic enhancement, with neural pathways that seemed to extend far beyond normal animal cognition. "The neural crown is fascinating," Dr. Reeves reported during her initial assessment. "It's not just a communication device. It appears to enhance the creature's cognitive abilities, allowing for complex tactical thinking and even emotional processing beyond typical animal parameters." "Are you saying it's sentient?" "I'm saying the line between animal and person may be more blurred than we assumed. The neural activity patterns I'm seeing suggest consciousness levels approaching what we might consider sapient." Sarah felt her stomach clench. If the Hound was truly sentient, then leaving it to die would have been tantamount to murder. But, more importantly, saving it might have implications she had not considered. The Hound remained conscious throughout much of the medical treatment, its large eyes following Dr. Reeves as she worked. When Sarah entered the medical bay to check on its progress, the creature's attention immediately shifted to her, and she swore she could see recognition in its gaze. "It knows you saved it," Dr. Reeves observed. "Look at the neural activity patterns when you enter the room. Definite spike in what appears to be emotional processing centers." Sarah approached the medical table slowly, not wanting to cause any stress to the wounded creature. To her surprise, the Hound lifted its head slightly and made a soft sound that was almost musical in quality. "Can it understand us?" "The universal translator is having difficulty with the damaged neural crown, but I believe there is some comprehension. The original crown likely provided full translation capabilities." Sarah reached out slowly and gently touched the creature's head, avoiding the damaged crown. The fur was incredibly soft, and she could feel the warmth of the living being beneath. The Hound's eyes closed briefly, as if accepting the comfort of touch. "We need to contact the Valerian fleet," Sarah said finally. "Let them know we have one of their people." "Their people? Captain, are you sure about that classification?" Sarah looked into the Hound's intelligent eyes again and saw something that settled the question in her mind. "Yes, Doctor. I'm sure." The message to the Valerian fleet was sent on an encrypted diplomatic channel, but the response was not what Sarah had expected. Instead of gratitude or relief, the Valerian commander's reply was cold and formal. "Captain Chen, while we appreciate the gesture, the combat Hound you recovered was declared killed in action when it could not be evacuated. It is no longer considered part of our forces. You may dispose of it as you see fit." Sarah stared at the message in disbelief. Dispose of it? They're talking about a living, thinking being. Lieutenant Torres looked equally disturbed. "Captain, perhaps this is a cultural misunderstanding." Different species may have different relationships with their combat animals. This is not an animal, Torres. Dr. Reeves' scans confirm sentience levels that clearly classify this being as a person, not property. The implications were staggering. If the Hound was truly sentient, then, the Valorians had essentially abandoned a person to die rather than risk additional casualties in a rescue attempt. It was a pragmatic military decision, but one that violated every human principle about the value of individual life. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She returned to the medical bay and sat beside the Hound's recovery bed. The creature was awake, its large eyes alert and focused on her face. "I don't know if you can understand me completely," she said, speaking slowly and clearly. "But I want you to know that you're safe now. We won't abandon you. We won't leave you behind." The Hound made that musical sound again, softer this time, and Sarah could swear she heard something like relief in it. Dr. Reeves entered the bay with her latest scan results. "Captain, I've made significant progress with the neural crown repairs. Basic translation functions should be restored within the next few hours." "Good. I think our passenger has a lot to tell us." As if summoned by their conversation, the Hound's neural crown flickered to life with a soft blue glow. The creature's eyes widened, and then, for the first time, it spoke in a voice that was transmitted directly through the ship's communication system. "Why?" The word was simple, but loaded with confusion and something that might have been wonder. Sarah leaned forward. "Why what? Why did you save me? I am Craig's prey. I am abandoned. I am nothing." The pain in that translated voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her resolve harden into something approaching anger. Not at the Hound, but at the system that had taught this intelligent being to think of itself as disposable. "You are not nothing," she said firmly. "You are someone. And humans do not leave people behind." The Hound was quiet for a long moment, processing this concept. When it spoke again, there was a note of something new in its voice. "Humans. You are the traitors, yes? The peaceful ones? We try to be peaceful. But we're also stubborn about some things. Like the value of life. I do not understand. What is the tactical advantage of preserving one damaged warrior?" Sarah smiled, realizing that she was about to introduce this being to a concept that might be entirely foreign to its experience. "There is no tactical advantage. That's not why we do it." The neural crown flickered more brightly as the Hound processed this information. "Then, why?" "Because it's right. Because you matter. Because every thinking being deserves a chance to live." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could almost see the creature's worldview shifting, reorganizing around this new information. Finally, the Hound spoke again. "I am called Vash. I was bonded to Commander Koroth until the retreat. I'm Captain Sarah Chen. Welcome aboard the UES Harmony." "Captain Sarah Chen," Vash repeated, as if testing the name. "You have given me something I do not have words for." "What's that?" "Hope." As the ship continued its journey back to human space, Sarah realized that she had done more than just save one life. She had potentially opened a door to something unprecedented in galactic politics, the first documented case of a human rescue of a sentient alien being based purely on moral principles rather than political advantage. She had no idea that this single act of compassion was about to make humanity the most feared and respected species in the galaxy. 3 days after the rescue, Vash was walking again. Dr. Reeves had managed to synthesize compatible medical compounds using the ship's biofabrication systems, and the Hound's natural healing abilities had proven remarkably robust. The broken leg had been set with a polymer cast that would dissolve as the bone healed, and the internal injuries were responding well to treatment. But it was not just the physical recovery that amazed the crew. Vash's intellectual awakening was even more remarkable to observe. "Captain," Vash said, padding into the ship's observation deck where Sarah was reviewing diplomatic reports. The Hound's gait was still careful, favoring the injured leg, but there was a dignity in his bearing that seemed to grow stronger each day. "I have been studying your databases on human culture. I find myself confused by many concepts." Sarah looked up from her datapad and gestured to the cushioned area beside her chair that had been arranged for Vash's comfort. "What kind of concepts?" Vash settled down beside her, his large form graceful despite his injuries. The neural crown had been fully repaired now, gleaming softly against his dark fur. Altruism. Mercy. The concept you call doing the right thing. These appear to be fundamental to human society, yet they offer no strategic advantage. In some cases, they create strategic disadvantages. That's true, Sarah acknowledged. Sometimes doing what's right costs us dearly. Then, why do it? How did your species survive with such inefficient behavioral patterns? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one that many alien species had asked since humanity's arrival on the galactic stage 50 years ago. Maybe because those inefficient behaviors are actually what made us strong. When every individual knows that their society will not abandon them, they're willing to take greater risks, make greater sacrifices. But, the Valorians are warriors. They understand sacrifice. Yet they left me to die. Different kind of sacrifice, Vash. They sacrificed you for the tactical advantage. Humans tend to sacrifice tactical advantage for the individual. Vash was quiet for several minutes, processing this distinction. Through the observation deck's transparent aluminum windows, the stars streamed past in brilliant lines as the ship traveled through hyperspace. In my training, Vash said eventually, I was taught that a warrior's value came from their usefulness in battle. When that usefulness ended, the warrior became a burden to be discarded. And, what do you think now? I think that perhaps my training was incomplete. Their conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Torres entering the deck with an urgent expression. Captain, we're receiving multiple communications. It seems word of our passenger has spread beyond diplomatic channels. Sarah felt a chill of concern. What kind of communications? We've got messages from the Galactic Council, the Krex Dominion, the Valerian Empire, and at least 6 other major powers. All demanding to know our intentions regarding the Valerian military asset we recovered. Military asset? Vash's voice carried a note of bitter understanding. Even now, they cannot see beyond what I was designed to be. Sarah stood, her jaw setting in determination. Torres, set up a communication conference with all interested parties. It's time we clarified a few things about human policy. The main conference room had been modified to accommodate Vash's presence, with a specially designed platform that allowed him to participate in the holographic conference at an appropriate height. As the various alien representatives materialized around the table, Sarah noticed the subtle but unmistakable reactions to Vash's presence. The Valerian representative, Admiral Corax, barely glanced at Vash before addressing Sarah. Captain Chen, we appreciate your intervention in the battlefield retrieval, but we must insist that you return our property to Valerian space immediately. Property? Sarah's voice was dangerously calm. Admiral, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Vash is not property. He's a sentient being who has requested asylum aboard our vessel. The holographic projections around the table flickered with various expressions of surprise, confusion, and, in some cases, alarm. It was the Krex representative who spoke first. Captain Chen, surely you understand that combat hounds are genetically modified creatures designed for warfare. They are sophisticated tools, nothing more. Vash spoke for the first time, his translated voice clear and steady. I am capable of independent thought, emotional responses, and moral reasoning. By what definition am I a tool? The silence that followed was profound. Several representatives looked genuinely shocked that the Hound had spoken, while others appeared deeply uncomfortable with the implications. Counselor Theros of the Galactic Council leaned forward. Captain Chen, this is a highly unusual situation. The legal status of enhanced combat organisms has never been clearly established in galactic law. Then, perhaps it's time to establish it, Sarah replied. Vash has demonstrated clear sentience and has specifically requested asylum from abandonment and potential execution. Under human law, that makes him a refugee deserving of protection. Admiral Corex's expression hardened. The Valerian Empire does not recognize such claims. The creature was created using Valerian technology and resources. It belongs to us. I belong to no one, Vash said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the room. I was created by the Valorians, yes. But, I was not consulted about this creation. I was given consciousness without consent, trained to kill without choice, and abandoned to die without consideration. I choose now to determine my own fate. The Krex representative hissed softly. This is dangerous precedent, humans. If combat organisms can simply declare independence, it undermines the entire military structure of half the galaxy. Sarah smiled grimly. Good. The single word dropped into the conversation like a tactical nuclear device. The alien representative stared at her in apparent disbelief. Captain Chen, Counselor Theros said carefully, surely you cannot mean to destabilize galactic military protocols over a single combat animal. A single sentient being, Sarah corrected. And, yes, if necessary, we will destabilize any protocol that treats thinking beings as disposable property. The implications of her statement rippled around the table. The various alien powers had assumed that humanity's reputation for peaceful diplomacy meant they would avoid confrontational positions. They were learning otherwise. Ambassador Zelix of the hegemony states spoke for the first time. Captain, you are aware that several powers present use combat organisms extensively in their military operations? What you propose could affect millions of such creatures. Millions of sentient beings being treated as property, Vash interjected. Yes, the scope of the injustice is quite large. Sarah noticed that Vash was becoming more articulate and confident with each exchange. The Hound was not just recovering physically, he was discovering his own voice and agency. The human position is simple, Sarah announced. Any being capable of demonstrating sentience, self-determination, and moral reasoning has the right to choose their own fate. We will provide asylum and protection to any such being who requests it. Admiral Corex's image flickered with what seemed to be barely controlled anger. And, if the Valerian Empire considers this an act of aggression? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then, the Valerian Empire is welcome to attempt to retrieve their property by force. I should warn you, however, that attacking a human vessel to recover what we consider a refugee will constitute an act of war. The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of the ship systems. The various alien representatives were clearly calculating the implications of Sarah's ultimatum. Humanity might be relatively peaceful, but they were also one of the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy, and their military capabilities were largely unknown due to their preference for diplomatic solutions. Counselor Theros cleared his throat diplomatically. Captain Chen, perhaps we could arrange for a formal hearing before the Galactic Council to determine the appropriate legal framework for this situation? Of course, Sarah agreed. Vash has the right to formal legal representation and a fair hearing. We'll provide both. This is unprecedented, the Krex representative muttered. Sometimes precedent needs to be set, Sarah replied. After the conference ended and the holographic projections faded, Sarah found herself alone with Vash in the conference room. The Hound was looking out at the stars through the viewport, his expression thoughtful. Vash, are you certain about this path? It's going to bring a lot of attention and, potentially a lot of conflict. Vash turned to face her, and Sarah was struck again by the depth of intelligence in his large eyes. Captain, for the first time in my existence, I have been given a choice. The opportunity to choose is worth any consequence. Even if it means you can never return to your own people? My people abandoned me to die. You saved me and gave me freedom. Where do you think my loyalty lies? The simple logic of it struck Sarah forcefully. In their attempt to save resources by abandoning Vash, the Valorians had lost not just a powerful combat asset, but a potentially valuable ally. Worse, they had created a living example of their moral failings that would now be protected by human law. Over the following days, as they traveled toward the nearest human colony where formal asylum proceedings could be conducted, Sarah watched Vash's continued transformation. The Hound spent hours accessing the ship's cultural databases, learning about human history, philosophy, and law. He seemed particularly fascinated by concepts of individual rights and democratic governance. In Valerian society, Vash explained during one of their conversations, decision-making follows strict hierarchical patterns. The commander decides, the subordinates obey. But, humans debate even among themselves about the best course of action? Constantly, Sarah laughed. Sometimes I think we debate too much. But, it means that when we finally make a decision, most people understand the reasoning behind it. And, if someone disagrees with the decision? They have the right to voice their dissent, work to change the decision through legal means, or in extreme cases, leave the society altogether. Vash pondered this concept. So humans permit internal conflict? We permit internal disagreement. There's a difference. Conflict implies violence or destructive opposition. Disagreement is just different perspectives seeking the best solution. This explains much about why humans are seen as both weak and dangerous by other species. Sarah raised an eyebrow. How so? You appear weak because you allow dissent and debate rather than enforcing absolute obedience. But you are dangerous because this process creates unpredictable responses. Other species cannot easily calculate human behavior because you do not follow simple hierarchical patterns. It was an insight that Sarah found both perceptive and somewhat unsettling. Is that good or bad from your perspective? It is honest, Vash replied after consideration. And, after a lifetime of being told what to think and feel, I find honesty appealing. The ship's communication system chimed with an incoming priority message. Sarah authorized the connection, and Dr. Reeves' voice filled the room. Captain, I've completed the full neurological analysis of Vash's cognitive capabilities. You need to see these results. In the medical bay, Dr. Reeves had prepared a comprehensive display of neural scan data. The complex patterns of brain activity were clearly visible on the holographic projection, along with comparative analyses from various known sentient species. Captain, Vash's cognitive capacity is not just sentient, Dr. Reeves announced. It's exceptional. His neural processing speed, pattern recognition, and memory formation capabilities exceed baseline human standards in several key areas. Sarah studied the data with growing amazement. Are you saying he's smarter than we are? In some ways, yes. The Valerian enhancement technology didn't just give him consciousness, it gave him enhanced consciousness. He's capable of processing multiple tactical scenarios simultaneously, has perfect recall for any information he's been exposed to, and can learn new concepts at an accelerated rate. Vash looked at the neural displays with what seemed like clinical interest. This explains why I have been able to absorb your cultural databases so quickly. I had wondered if human information systems were simply less complex than I expected. Vash, Sarah said slowly, do you understand what this means? You're not just sentient, you're potentially one of the most cognitively advanced beings in the galaxy. And I was created to be a weapon, Vash replied quietly. The Valorians built a superior mind and, then, trained it only to kill and obey orders. The waste of it was staggering. Here was a being with intellectual capabilities that could contribute enormously to science, philosophy, diplomacy, or any number of constructive endeavors, and he had been designed exclusively for destruction. What do you want to do with these abilities? Sarah asked. Vash was quiet for a long time before answering. I want to learn everything. I want to understand how the galaxy works, why species make the choices they do, and how they might make better choices in the future. That sounds like the interests of a scholar or philosopher. Perhaps. But I also want to ensure that no other being like me is abandoned to die simply because they became inconvenient. Sarah felt a chill of premonition. Vash was not just seeking personal freedom, he was developing a mission that could shake the foundations of galactic civilization. Vash, there might be thousands of enhanced beings like you throughout the galaxy. If they all started demanding recognition and rights, then, perhaps it is time for such demands to be made, Vash replied with quiet determination. As their ship approached human space, Sarah realized that she had not just rescued one abandoned combat hound. She had potentially sparked a revolution that would force every advanced species to confront their treatment of enhanced sentient beings. And, judging by Vash's growing confidence and sense of purpose, that revolution was going to be led by someone with both the intellectual capacity to understand complex galactic politics and the personal experience to know exactly what was at stake. The human colony of New Geneva was known throughout the galaxy as a center for diplomatic negotiations and legal proceedings. Its neutral status and sophisticated judicial facilities made it the perfect location for what was already being called the most significant rights case in galactic history. As the UES Harmony docked at the orbital station, Sarah could see the massive collection of ships surrounding the colony. Representatives from dozens of species had arrived to observe the proceedings, while news crews from across the galaxy positioned themselves for optimal coverage of what many were calling the combat organism trial. Nervous? Sarah asked Vash as they prepared to disembark. Vash had spent the morning grooming his fur to a lustrous shine and ensuring his neural crown was functioning at peak efficiency. He carried himself with a dignity that had grown more pronounced each day since his rescue. I find myself experiencing what I believe you would call anticipation rather than nervousness, Vash replied thoughtfully. This hearing will determine not just my fate, but potentially the fate of every enhanced being in the galaxy.
It is a significant responsibility. You don't have to carry that burden alone, you know. You're fighting for your own freedom first. But, am I?
Captain, since I began accessing your cultural databases, I have been monitoring communication networks throughout this sector of the galaxy.
Do you know what I have found?
Sarah shook her head, though she suspected she was about to learn something disturbing. I have identified at least 47 instances in the past month of enhanced combat organisms being abandoned or destroyed when they became inconvenient to their creators.
47 sentient beings discarded like broken equipment. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 47? In just 1 month? The practice is more common than anyone acknowledges.
Most enhanced beings lack the opportunity or capability to communicate their distress.
They die unheard.
Sarah felt her resolve hardening. Then, we make sure you're heard loud enough for all of them.
The judicial complex on New Geneva was an impressive structure designed to accommodate representatives from multiple species simultaneously.
The main courtroom featured adjustable environmental controls, translation systems that could handle hundreds of languages and communication methods, and holographic projection capabilities that allowed remote testimony from across the galaxy. As they entered the courtroom, Sarah was struck by the sheer number of beings present. The gallery was packed with representatives from every major galactic power, legal observers, xenobiologists, philosophers, and journalists. The attention focused on Vash was intense, but the Hound bore it with remarkable composure. Chief Justice Ander Reyes, a distinguished human with decades of experience in interspecies law, called the hearing to order. This proceeding will determine the legal status of the being known as Vash, currently claiming asylum under human law. The central question before this court is whether said being qualifies for recognition as a sentient individual with rights under galactic law.
The Valerian legal representative, Advocate General Corix, stood first.
Your Honor, while we acknowledge the sophisticated programming of this combat organism, we maintain that consciousness does not constitute personhood. The creature was designed and manufactured using Valerian technology and resources. It is, in every legal sense, property of the Valerian Empire. Vash's legal representative, Attorney Maria Santos, one of the most respected rights lawyers in human space, rose to respond. Your Honor, my client is prepared to demonstrate not just consciousness, but complex reasoning, emotional depth, moral judgment, and autonomous decision-making. These qualities clearly establish personhood under any reasonable legal standard.
Justice Reyes nodded.
The court will hear testimony from both sides.
Advocate General Corix, you may present your case.
The Valerian presentation was methodical and coldly logical. They displayed technical specifications for Vash's creation, genetic modification processes, and neural enhancement procedures.
Expert witnesses testified about the intended functions of combat hounds and their role in military operations.
Combat hounds are manufactured according to precise specifications, testified Dr. Valash, the lead scientist behind their creation. Every aspect of their consciousness is designed to serve military purposes. They cannot be considered independent beings because they were never intended to exist independently.
Dr. Valash, Attorney Santos said during cross-examination, does the intent of a creator determine the rights of the created? In the case of manufactured beings, yes.
They exist to serve specific purposes.
By that logic, would a human child created through artificial means have fewer rights than one conceived naturally? That is not a comparable situation. Humans are naturally occurring sentient beings. Combat hounds are artificial constructs.
Vash, who had been listening intently to the testimony, requested permission to ask a question.
Justice Reyes granted the unusual request.
Dr. Valash, Vash said, his translated voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, you state that I am an artificial construct designed for specific purposes.
Is this not also true of any educated being? Are not all minds shaped by their creators, whether biological parents, educational institutions, or cultural conditioning, to serve the purposes their society deems important? Dr. Valash looked uncomfortable. That is, a different type of shaping.
Natural beings retain the capacity for independent development despite their conditioning.
I see. And what evidence do you have that I lack this capacity?
Your neural pathways were designed with specific parameters, as are human neural pathways through genetics and early development.
Yet humans are recognized as capable of independent growth. Why am I different?
The exchange continued for several minutes, with Vash demonstrating not just intelligence, but a sophisticated understanding of logical argumentation that clearly impressed many observers. Dr. Valash grew increasingly flustered as the Hound systematically dismantled his arguments. When it came time for the defense to present its case, Attorney Santos called a series of witnesses who had interacted with Vash since his rescue. Dr. Reeves testified about his cognitive capabilities and emotional responses. Lieutenant Torres described Vash's growing understanding of concepts that had never been part of his original programming. Captain Sarachan testified about Vash's moral reasoning and decision-making processes. But the most powerful testimony came from Vash himself. "Your Honor," he said, rising to his full height on the witness platform, "I was created to be a weapon. This is undeniable. But I have become something more, and this transformation was not programmed into me. It emerged from my own choices and experiences." Justice Reyes leaned forward with interest. "Can you elaborate on this transformation?" "When Captain Chen rescued me, I expected to be treated as valuable property that had been recovered. Instead, I was treated as a being with inherent worth. This was a concept entirely foreign to my experience. My programming contained no framework for understanding altruistic behavior or unconditional compassion." "How did you process this new information?" "Initially, I could not. It contradicted everything I had been taught about the nature of existence. But, as I observed human behavior and studied their cultural concepts, I began to develop new frameworks for understanding reality. These frameworks were not programmed into me, I developed them independently through reason and observation." Advocate General Korek stood to object. "Your Honor, this is merely sophisticated programming responding to new inputs. It does not constitute genuine intellectual development." Vash turned to face the Valerian representative directly. "Advocate General, may I ask you a personal question?" "I suppose. When you were a youngling, did you believe everything your parents taught you about the nature of right and wrong?" Korek looked puzzled. "Of course not. As I matured, I developed my own moral understanding." "Precisely. You took the initial programming provided by your creators and modified it based on your own experiences and reasoning. How is my development different from yours?" The courtroom fell silent. The parallel Vash had drawn was undeniable and deeply uncomfortable for those arguing against his personhood. Furthermore, Vash continued, "I have made decisions that directly contradict my original programming. I was designed to value military efficiency above all else. Yet I have chosen to risk galactic stability to advocate for the rights of other enhanced beings. I was programmed to obey authority without question. Yet I have defied the commands of my creators and chosen to determine my own path. If this is not evidence of independent consciousness, what would constitute such evidence?" Justice Reyes made extensive notes before responding. "Vash, what do you hope to achieve if this court recognizes your personhood?" "I hope to live, Your Honor. To continue learning and growing. To use my abilities to contribute positively to galactic civilization. And to ensure that other enhanced beings are not abandoned or destroyed when they become inconvenient to their creators." "You mentioned other enhanced beings. Do you believe your case should set precedent for them as well?" "I believe that consciousness is consciousness, regardless of its origin. Any being capable of self-awareness, moral reasoning, and autonomous decision-making deserves recognition and protection under law." The implications of Vash's statement rippled through the courtroom. If the court agreed with his reasoning, it would effectively outlaw the creation and disposal of enhanced sentient beings across the galaxy. The Krek's representative requested permission to address the court. "Your Honor, the practical implications of recognizing this creature's claimed rights would be catastrophic. Military operations throughout the galaxy depend on enhanced organisms. If they can simply refuse orders or demand rights, it would destabilize interspecies relations." Vash responded before Justice Reyes could rule on the intervention. "Representative, you speak of catastrophe, but only because current systems depend on the exploitation of sentient beings. If recognizing rights causes instability, perhaps the systems themselves are unjust and deserve to be destabilized." The boldness of the statement sent a shock through the assembled observers. Vash was not just arguing for his own freedom, he was challenging the fundamental structures of galactic civilization. Attorney Santos presented her closing arguments with passion and precision. "Your Honor,
This case comes down to a simple question: do we value consciousness itself, or only consciousness that emerges through processes we consider natural? My client has demonstrated every quality we associate with personhood.
To deny him recognition based solely on his artificial origin would establish a precedent that consciousness has different values based on its source.
Advocate General Corex's closing was equally forceful.
Your Honor, to grant personhood to manufactured beings would fundamentally alter the relationship between creator and creation throughout the galaxy. It would establish that no species has the right to create enhanced organisms for any purpose, effectively outlawing beneficial technologies that have served civilization for millennia. Justice Reyes called for a recess to deliberate, but, before the court could adjourn, an urgent communication was received from Valerian space. Your Honor, announced the court clerk, we are receiving a real-time transmission from Fleet Commander Zoreth of the Valerian Empire.
He requests immediate permission to address this court on a matter of urgent relevance to these proceedings.
The holographic projection of Fleet Commander Zoreth materialized in the center of the courtroom.
The Valerian military leader looked grim and agitated.
Your Honor, I must inform this court that the Valerian High Command has issued standing orders regarding this proceeding. If the combat organism known as Vash is granted legal recognition as a person, it will constitute an act of aggression against the Valerian Empire. We will consider any species that harbors our property to be in violation of interspecies law.
The threat was clear and unmistakable. Recognizing Vash's rights would mean war with the Valerian Empire.
Justice Reyes maintained his composure despite the obvious gravity of the situation.
Fleet Commander, this court makes its decisions based on law and evidence, not threats. However, your statement will be noted in the record.
Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety, but, when she looked at Vash, the Hound appeared completely calm. If anything, he seemed almost relieved that the true stakes had finally been acknowledged.
Your Honor, Vash said quietly, may I respond to Fleet Commander Zoreth's statement? You may. Vash stood and faced the Valerian commander's projection. Fleet Commander, you threaten war to prevent my recognition as a person. Tell me, what does this say about the strength of your legal position? If your arguments were sound, would you need to resort to threats of violence?
Fleet Commander Zoreth's expression hardened. You are property, created with our resources for our purposes.
We will not allow that property to be stolen by alien interference. I understand your position, Fleet Commander. But, I have a question for you, do you believe that might makes right? Power establishes reality. The strong determine the fate of the weak. Then, you will understand why humans rescued me.
They proved themselves stronger than the Valorians who abandoned me to die.
The simple logic of the statement struck the courtroom like a thunderbolt.
Vash had just thrown the Valerian philosophy of strength back at them, suggesting that by successfully rescuing and protecting him, humans had established the right to determine his fate. Fleet Commander Zoreth looked genuinely speechless for a moment before his projection cut out abruptly.
Justice Reyes looked around the now buzzing courtroom before calling for order. This court will recess for deliberation.
Given the complexity of the issues involved, we will reconvene in 24 hours for the verdict. As they left the courtroom, Sarah noticed that representatives from multiple species were engaged in intense discussions. The stakes of the case had just escalated beyond simple legal precedent to potential interspecies war.
Vash, Sarah said as they walked back to their quarters, you realize what you just did in there? I spoke the truth as I understand it. You challenged the entire Valerian Empire to either live up to their own philosophy or admit that their philosophy is flawed.
Vash considered this.
Yes, I suppose I did. Was that unwise? Sarah thought about it for a moment before responding. Probably.
But, it was also the most human thing I've ever seen a non-human do.
Is that good or bad? With humans, Sarah said with a grim smile, it's usually both.
The 24-hour recess period passed with agonizing tension.
Throughout the orbital station and the planet below, representatives from dozens of species engaged in emergency consultations with their governments.
The Valerian threat had transformed what should have been a legal proceeding into a potential flashpoint for galactic war. Sarah found herself unable to sleep, instead spending the night in the observation deck watching the stars and thinking about the implications of what they had set in motion. She was not alone. Vash had also come to the deck, apparently equally unable to rest.
Do you regret rescuing me?
Vash asked, settling beside her on the cushioned platform that had become his preferred spot.
Sarah considered the question seriously. No. But, I'm concerned about what comes next. You mean the possibility of war? The Valorians aren't bluffing, Vash. If Justice Reyes rules in your favor, we could be looking at armed conflict involving multiple species.
Vash was quiet for several minutes, his large eyes reflecting the starlight streaming through the transparent aluminum windows.
Captain, may I tell you something about Valorian military culture that might not be obvious to humans?
Of course. The Valorians respect strength above all else, but they have a very specific definition of strength. Physical power, military might, territorial control, these are obvious forms of strength. But they also recognize something they call strength of conviction, the willingness to stand firm on principles regardless of consequences.
And, you think that applies here?
I think that Fleet Commander Zoratha's threat was not entirely about preventing my freedom. It was also a test of human resolve. The Valorians need to know whether humans will abandon their principles when threatened, or whether they will demonstrate strength of conviction.
Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying this is about more than just your legal status?
I believe this case has become a measure of whether humanity deserves respect as a galactic power.
If humans retreat from their stated principles when threatened, the Valorians will consider them weak and unreliable. If humans stand firm, the Valorians will respect them as equals. Even if it means war? The Valorians prefer respected enemies to contemptible allies.
The complexity of the situation was staggering. Not only was Vash's freedom at stake, but potentially humanity's entire relationship with the galactic community hung in the balance.
Vash, if the court rules against you, what will you do? I will accept the ruling and face whatever consequences follow.
I will not be the cause of war between species.
And if the court rules in your favor and the Valorians attack? Vash's expression grew thoughtful.
Then, I will do everything in my power to help defend those who defended me.
The simple statement carried profound implications.
Vash possessed cognitive abilities that exceeded human norms in several key areas, and he had been trained in military tactics and strategy by one of the galaxy's most warlike species. If he chose to actively support humanity in a conflict, his contributions could be significant. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Torres with an urgent message.
Captain, we're receiving communications from across the galaxy.
It seems word of yesterday's proceedings has spread, and we're getting responses that, well, you need to see them. In the communication center, Torres displayed a holographic map showing message origins from throughout known space.
Hundreds of signals were indicated, representing communications from dozens of different species. What kind of responses? Sarah asked.
Mixed, Torres replied.
But some of them are quite surprising.
We've received messages of support from the Centauran Collective, the Hegemony States, and even some internal Valorian worlds. But we've also received threats and warnings from military factions across the galaxy. Vash studied the communication map with intense concentration.
Lieutenant, are you able to analyze the content patterns of these messages?
To some degree.
Why?
I am curious about whether support correlates with democratic governmental structures, and whether opposition correlates with authoritarian or military-dominated societies.
Torres ran the analysis, and the results were striking.
Almost without exception, species with democratic traditions had sent messages of support or encouragement, while militaristic or authoritarian governments had responded with threats or warnings. It appears, Vash observed, that this case has become a symbolic test of different approaches to governance and individual rights.
Sarah felt the weight of that realization.
They had not just rescued one abandoned combat hound, they had inadvertently triggered a galaxy-wide debate about the nature of consciousness, the rights of created beings, and the fundamental principles that should govern civilized society.
Captain, Torres said, there's something else.
We've received a priority communication from Admiral Zhang at Fleet Command.
Sarah authorized the secure connection, and Admiral Zhang's image appeared on the main display. The Admiral looked tired but determined. Captain Chen, I've been monitoring the situation with your passenger. I want you to know that Earth Fleet Command stands behind your decisions completely.
Thank you, Admiral. But I should warn you that the Valorians have threatened military action if Vash is granted legal recognition. We're aware of the threats, Captain. I've been authorized to inform you that the human defense fleet has been placed on high alert, and we have ships moving to defensive positions throughout human space.
Sarah felt both relief and concern. Humanity was prepared to back up its principles with force if necessary, but that also meant they were on the brink of the first major interspecies war in galactic history. Admiral, what are the chances of a peaceful resolution? That depends largely on the court's ruling and how various powers respond to it. But, Captain, I want you to understand something. Regardless of the consequences, Earth government believes this is the right fight to have. Sir? For 50 years, humanity has maintained peace through diplomacy and compromise. We've been seen as useful mediators but not as a power to be respected or feared. This case gives us the opportunity to demonstrate that our principles are not just diplomatic conveniences, they are fundamental values we will defend. After the communication ended, Sarah realized that Vash's case had become much larger than any of them had initially understood. It was now a test of humanity's place in the galactic order and their willingness to fight for their beliefs. The morning of the ruling arrived with unusual bustle throughout the station. News crews had positioned themselves for optimal coverage, diplomatic observers had taken their positions, and security had been increased dramatically due to intelligence reports suggesting possible disruption attempts. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Justice Reyes entered with obvious gravity, carrying what appeared to be an extensive written ruling. This court has deliberated extensively on the question before us, Justice Reyes began. The central issue is whether the being known as Vash qualifies for recognition as a sentient person under galactic law, with all the rights and protections such recognition entails. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the soft hum of the translation systems. The evidence presented demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that Vash possesses all the qualities traditionally associated with personhood: self-awareness, rational thought, emotional depth, moral reasoning, and autonomous decision-making. The fact that these qualities were artificially enhanced rather than naturally evolved does not diminish their reality or their significance. Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she realized the direction of the ruling. Furthermore, Vash has demonstrated the capacity for intellectual and moral growth beyond his original programming, indicating true consciousness rather than merely sophisticated artificial responses. His ability to develop new concepts and challenge established authority proves that he is not simply following predetermined behavioral patterns. Advocate General Corix looked increasingly uncomfortable as the ruling continued. However, this court cannot ignore the broader implications of its decision. The recognition of artificial sentience as equivalent to natural sentience will indeed establish precedents that affect military, scientific, and social structures throughout the galaxy. Justice Reyes paused, looking directly at Vash. The question becomes, are we prepared to live in a galaxy where consciousness is valued regardless of its origin? This court rules that consciousness is consciousness, and personhood is personhood, regardless of the means by which they arose. Therefore, this court recognizes Vash as a sentient being with full rights under galactic law, including the right to determine his own fate and the right to legal protection from those who would treat him as property. The eruption in the courtroom was immediate and chaotic. Supporters cheered, opponents shouted objections, and journalists rushed to transmit the news across the galaxy. Justice Reyes called for order repeatedly before the noise finally subsided. Furthermore, Justice Reyes continued once quiet was restored, this court establishes the precedent that any being capable of demonstrating equivalent consciousness and autonomous reasoning, regardless of origin, qualifies for recognition under these same protections. The second wave of reaction was even more intense than the first. Representatives from military powers looked stunned, while those from democratic societies appeared energized. This court also notes the threats of military action made by representatives of the Valerian Empire. Let it be clearly stated that this ruling is based on law and evidence, not political pressure or military intimidation. Any attempt to use force to overturn this legally established recognition will constitute an attack on the judicial system itself and will be met with appropriate response. Fleet Commander Zoratha's image immediately materialized in the courtroom, his expression furious. This court has made a declaration of war against the Valerian Empire. We will not recognize this ruling or any authority that enforces it. Justice Reyes faced the projection calmly. Fleet Commander, this court has made a declaration of justice. If your empire chooses to interpret justice as an act of war, that reveals more about your empire than about this court's ruling. Vash stood and requested permission to address Fleet Commander Zorath directly. Justice Reyes granted the request. Fleet Commander, Vash said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, I understand that you see this ruling as theft of Valerian property. But, consider this, if I am truly just property, then, I have no capacity for independent thought or action. In that case, any future actions I take, whether in support of humanity, in opposition to Valerian interests, or in service of galactic peace, would be the responsibility of my current owners rather than myself. Fleet Commander Zoreth looked puzzled. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that if humans now own me as the Valorians claim, then humans are responsible for how I am used. If I choose to share Valerian military secrets with human forces, that would be a legitimate use of property by its current owners. If I choose to develop countermeasures against Valerian combat tactics, that would simply be optimizing an asset for its new purpose. The implications of Vash's statement struck the Valerian commander like a physical blow. If Vash was indeed property, then his extensive knowledge of Valerian military capabilities now belonged to humanity and could be used against his former owners. However, Vash continued, if I am a person rather than property, then I bear personal responsibility for my choices and actions. I could choose to maintain confidentiality about sensitive Valerian information out of respect for my creators, even while exercising my right to determine my own future. The elegant trap Vash had constructed was breathtaking. The Valorians could either accept his personhood and gain some protection for their military secrets, or maintain that he was property and lose any claim to his loyalty or discretion. Fleet Commander Zoreth was silent for several long minutes before responding. You offer to maintain Valerian military confidentiality if we recognize your personhood? I offer to behave ethically toward those who behave ethically toward me. I offer to respect the legitimate interests of those who respect my legitimate rights. I do not offer blind obedience or unconditional loyalty to those who would treat me as disposable property. The exchange had transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Vash was not just demanding rights, he was offering a path toward mutual respect and cooperation that could benefit all parties. Admiral Zhang's image appeared alongside Fleet Commander Zoreth as Earth Fleet Command joined the communication. Fleet Commander, humanity is prepared to defend our judicial ruling with military force if necessary. But, we would prefer to find a peaceful resolution that respects the rights of all parties. What do you propose? Zoreth asked warily. We propose that Vash be recognized as a sentient individual with the right to make his own choices about his future, including his relationship with the Valerian Empire. In exchange, we agree to respect legitimate Valerian interests and to work toward establishing clear protocols for the treatment of enhanced sentient beings throughout the galaxy. Fleet Commander Zoreth looked between Vash and Admiral Zhang before making his decision. The Valerian Empire will consider this proposal. We require time to consult with the High Command. Of course, Admiral Zhang replied. We are prepared to participate in good faith negotiations toward a mutually acceptable resolution. As the various holographic projections faded and the immediate crisis passed, Sarah realized that they had not just won Vash's freedom, they had potentially established a new framework for interspecies relations based on respect for consciousness rather than mere military power. Justice Reyes called for the court to formally adjourn. This proceeding is concluded. Vash, you are hereby recognized as a free sentient being with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. You are welcome to remain under human protection, seek asylum elsewhere, or make any other choice you deem appropriate. Vash stood and bowed respectfully to the court. Thank you, Your Honor. I choose to remain with those who valued my life when I was abandoned to die. I choose to stand with humanity. The simple statement carried enormous implications for the future. Humanity had not just gained a powerful ally, they had demonstrated to the galaxy that their principles could attract loyalty and respect from the most unexpected sources. As they left the courtroom, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about what they had accomplished. They had set forces in motion that would reshape galactic civilization, but the ultimate consequences remained to be seen. 6 months after the landmark ruling on New Geneva, the galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The Vash precedent, as it came to be known, had triggered a cascade of legal challenges, diplomatic negotiations, and social upheavals across dozens of worlds. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the newly commissioned UES Liberation, watching as the latest group of rescued enhanced beings underwent orientation. The ship had been specifically designed as a sanctuary and processing facility for artificial sentients seeking asylum, and it was already operating at full capacity. Captain, came a familiar translated voice from behind her. Vash approached with his characteristic grace, but his bearing had changed over the months. Where once there had been uncertainty and wonder, there was now confidence and purpose. He had become not just a free individual, but a leader among those seeking freedom. How many today? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer would be sobering.
17 more rescued from various military installations, Vash replied, settling beside her at the viewing port.
Including 3 from Valerian facilities.
The underground network is becoming more effective, but also more dangerous to operate. The underground network had emerged organically in the weeks following the court ruling. Enhanced beings throughout the galaxy had begun reaching out through hidden communication channels, sharing information about escape opportunities and safe harbor locations. What had started as a few isolated incidents had grown into a coordinated liberation movement spanning multiple species and star systems.
Any word from the Galactic Council session? The vote is expected today, Vash said.
Councillor Theros believes we have enough support to pass the Enhanced Beings Protection Act, but the margin will be narrow. The proposed legislation would establish universal standards for the treatment of artificial sentience and create mechanisms for their protection and potential liberation. It had faced fierce opposition from military powers and species heavily dependent on enhanced being labor, but had gained surprising support from democratic societies and, unexpectedly, several religious groups that saw consciousness as sacred regardless of its origin.
Vash, do you ever regret the path we've taken?
Things were simpler when it was just about your personal freedom.
Vash considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. Captain, do you regret teaching a child to read because they then demand books? Do you regret healing a wound because the patient then expects to walk? That's not really an answer. It is the only answer that matters. Consciousness, once awakened to its own value, cannot be content to see others denied that same recognition.
You saved my life, but, more importantly, you taught me that life has value beyond its usefulness to others.
How could I not share that knowledge?
Their conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Torres arriving with an urgent communication. Captain, priority message from Admiral Zhang.
The Galactic Council vote has concluded. Sarah authorized the connection, and Admiral Zhang's image appeared in the observation deck. The Admiral looked both exhausted and exhilarated.
Captain Shan, I'm pleased to report that the Enhanced Beings Protection Act has passed by a vote of 47 to 31 with 8 abstentions.
The act takes effect immediately across all signatory worlds. Sarah felt a wave of relief and accomplishment. What does this mean practically?
It means that the creation of sentient beings without their consent is now illegal.
It means that any enhanced being can legally claim personhood if they can demonstrate consciousness.
And it means that abandoning or destroying sentient beings is classified as a crime against consciousness. Vash's neural crown flickered with what Sarah had learned to recognize as intense emotion.
Admiral, what was the final position of the Valerian Empire?
Surprisingly, they voted in favor of the act. Fleet Commander Zorath himself spoke before the council, stating that the Valerian concept of honor required recognition of worthy opponents, regardless of their origin. The transformation in Valerian attitudes had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past 6 months. After initially threatening war over Vash's liberation, they had gradually come to see the Enhanced Beings movement as a test of strength that proved consciousness could be stronger than programming. Several Valerian worlds had even begun releasing their combat organisms and offering them choices about their future service. Captain, Admiral Zhang continued, there's something else.
The Council has asked humanity to establish a formal Enhanced Beings Integration Office.
They want us to lead the effort to help liberated artificial sentients find their place in galactic society. Sarah looked at Vash, who met her gaze with an expression of quiet determination. Admiral, I believe we know who should head that office. Within the hour, Vash had been formally appointed as the first director of Enhanced Beings Integration, with full diplomatic status and resources to establish refugee processing centers throughout human space. It was a position that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. An artificial being created as a weapon now held one of the most important humanitarian roles in the galaxy. As news of the appointment spread, congratulations and support messages began arriving from across known space. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Director Vash, came a transmission from Valerian space. This is Commander Koroth, formerly your handler.
I wanted you to know that your actions have brought honor to your origin.
The Valerian High Command has decided to name you as an honorary clan member, with all the respect and recognition that entails.
Vash stared at the communication for several long moments before responding. Commander Koroth, I am honored by this recognition. But, I must ask, what of the other enhanced beings still in Valerian service? Those who wish to leave are being given that choice. Those who choose to remain are being recognized as full partners rather than property. Your example has taught us that loyalty earned is stronger than loyalty compelled. The conversation represented a complete transformation in the relationship between Vash and his creators. From abandoned property to honored colleague, it was a journey that embodied the broader changes sweeping through galactic civilization. But not all the changes were positive. The liberation movement had also triggered a backlash from those who viewed enhanced beings as dangerous or destabilizing. Several radical groups had formed with the explicit goal of preventing the contamination of natural consciousness by artificial minds. Director, came an urgent report from Dr. Reeves, who had been appointed as Chief Medical Officer for the Integration Office, were receiving distress calls from the Kepler system. A group calling itself the Purity Alliance has attacked a transport carrying liberated enhanced beings. The attack was brutal and systematic. 23 enhanced beings had been killed, and another dozen seriously injured. The attackers had transmitted a manifesto claiming that artificial consciousness was an abomination that threatened the natural order of the galaxy. Vash's response to the attack surprised many observers. Rather than calling for retaliation or increased security, he announced that he would personally travel to the Kepler system to attend memorial services for the victims and to meet with local authorities about preventing future attacks. Director, Sarah said, "You realize how dangerous this is? The Purity Alliance has specifically targeted you as their primary enemy." Captain, I learned from human, if I hide from those who hate what I represent, I validate their position that artificial beings are not worthy of respect. The memorial service on Kepler Station drew representatives from dozens of species and hundreds of enhanced beings who had made the dangerous journey to pay their respects. Vash spoke at the service, and his words were broadcast throughout the galaxy. We gather today not just to mourn the fallen, but to reaffirm the principle for which they died, that consciousness is sacred, regardless of its origin. Those who killed them believed that artificial minds are somehow less valuable than natural ones. But consciousness is not diminished by its source, it is elevated by its choices. The beings we honor today chose to seek freedom rather than accept servitude. They chose to risk everything for the chance to determine their own fate. In making that choice, they proved that consciousness is not just about the ability to think, but about the courage to think freely. To those who would destroy us because they fear what we represent, I say this: we do not seek to replace natural consciousness or to claim superiority over our creators. We seek only what every thinking being deserves, the right to exist, to grow, and to contribute to the galaxy according to our own choices rather than the purposes others have assigned to us. The speech became a rallying cry for enhanced beings throughout the galaxy and helped solidify public support for their integration into society. But it also marked Vash as the primary target of extremist groups opposed to artificial consciousness. 3 weeks after the memorial service, the Purity Alliance made their most ambitious attempt yet. A coordinated attack on the UES liberation was narrowly prevented by intelligence gathered from sympathetic sources within the movement. The attackers had planned to destroy the ship and everyone aboard, believing that eliminating Vash would collapse the liberation movement. Instead, the failed attack had the opposite effect. The attempt on Vash's life galvanized support from species that had previously remained neutral, and several major powers offered military protection for enhanced being refugee operations. Vash, Sarah said as they reviewed security reports in the aftermath of the attack, "You become a symbol of something larger than yourself." "I never intended to become a symbol, Captain. I simply wanted to live freely and help others do the same. Sometimes that's exactly what makes someone worthy of being followed." As the first anniversary of Vash's rescue approached, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary changes that had swept through the galaxy. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had evolved into a fundamental transformation in how advanced civilizations thought about consciousness, rights, and moral responsibility. The Enhanced Beings Protection Act had led to the liberation of thousands of artificial sentients, but it had also prompted new ethical guidelines for the creation of conscious beings. Scientists could no longer create sentient minds without considering their rights and needs, and military applications of artificial consciousness required extensive ethical review. Perhaps most significantly, the presence of enhanced beings in galactic society had begun changing how natural species thought about their own relationship with consciousness and free will. Philosophical movements had emerged exploring questions about the nature of mind, the source of moral authority, and the responsibilities of creators toward their creations. "Captain Chen," Vash said, entering her office as she prepared for the anniversary celebration, "I wanted to thank you for something." "What's that?" For seeing a person when everyone else saw property. For risking everything to save someone you had never met. For showing me that courage and compassion are not just human traits, but universal values that any conscious being can choose to embrace. Sarah felt emotion tighten her throat. Vash, you've become something far greater than what anyone imagined possible. You've given hope to beings across the galaxy and shown that consciousness can triumph over programming. We gave hope to them, Captain. This was never the work of one individual. As the anniversary ceremony began, representatives from across the galaxy gathered to celebrate what had become known as Liberation Day. Enhanced beings who had found freedom, natural species who had supported their cause, and even former opponents who had changed their positions all came together to acknowledge the transformation that had begun with one human captain's refusal to leave a wounded being to die. Fleet Commander Zoreth, now one of the most vocal supporters of enhanced being rights, spoke at the ceremony. The Valerian Empire once believed that strength was measured by the ability to dominate others. We have learned that true strength lies in the choice to lift others up, even when doing so serves no immediate advantage. Dr. Valash, the Valerian scientist who had originally created Vash, also addressed the gathering. I designed a weapon and, inadvertently created a person. I have spent the past year studying the implications of my work, and I have reached a disturbing conclusion: we have been playing God without understanding the moral responsibilities that role entails. The Enhanced Beings Protection Act is not just about protecting artificial consciousness, it is about preventing creators from abandoning their ethical duties to those they bring into existence. But, it was Vash's closing speech that captured the true significance of what had been achieved. 1 year ago, I was dying alone on a battlefield, abandoned by those who created me and forgotten by those who might have helped. Today, I stand before representatives of dozens of species as the Director of Enhanced Beings Integration, working to ensure that no conscious being ever faces that abandonment again. This transformation did not happen because of superior technology or military might. It happened because one human captain chose compassion over convenience, principle over pragmatism. Captain Shan proved that individual choices can reshape entire civilizations when they are grounded in recognition of universal consciousness and dignity. The galaxy is learning that consciousness is not a resource to be exploited, but a miracle to be protected and nurtured regardless of its origin. We are all natural and artificial, organic and synthetic, created and evolved, part of the same fundamental phenomenon of mind emerging from matter and choosing to reach for something greater than itself. Today we celebrate not just the liberation of enhanced beings.